Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Dollmaker's Curse. Holly Arnold had always been enchanted by the quiet charm of the Isle of Wight. After years in the bustling city, she craved the tranquility that only a small, seaside town could offer. She had inherited her grandmother's cottage, a quaint little place nestled at the edge of a dense forest. The locals told her that the woods were ancient, full of secrets and stories that went back centuries. Holly, with her love for folklore and history, found herself drawn to these whispered tales, especially those surrounding the old dollmaker who had once lived in the heart of the forest. The dollmaker's shop had been closed for decades, its once bright windows now coated with dust and grime, obscuring the treasures within. Holly first heard about the shop from Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly woman who ran the local general store. The old dollmaker, Mr. Grimsby, was a recluse, Mrs. Caldwell had said, her voice low with caution. He was known for crafting the most beautiful dolls, but they say those dolls were cursed. Folks claimed the dolls took on the feelings of their owners, trapping them inside, and if the owner was filled with sorrow, anger, or fear, well, those emotions would consume them. Intrigued and undeterred by the warnings, Holly decided to visit the abandoned shop. She had always loved antiques, and the thought of finding a forgotten doll in the old shop excited her. She imagined the delicate porcelain faces, the carefully sewn dresses, the tiny glass eyes that seemed almost lifelike. The path to the shop wound deep into the forest, the trees growing thicker and more twisted the farther she went. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Finally, she arrived at the clearing where the dollmaker's shop stood, a small, crooked building that looked as if it had been untouched for years. The roof was sagging, and the windows were cracked, but the door, surprisingly, was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, Holly stepped inside. The interior was dim, the only light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight, and the air was thick with the smell of time and abandonment. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dolls of every shape and size, each one more exquisite than the last. There were porcelain dolls with delicate features, rag dolls with button eyes, and wooden dolls with intricately carved faces. But there was one doll that immediately caught Holly's eye. It was larger than the others, seated on a chair in the center of the room. The doll was dressed in a beautiful, old-fashioned gown of deep burgundy velvet with lace trim at the sleeves and collar. Its hair was a cascade of dark curls, and its eyes, Holly could have sworn they were real for a moment, were a deep, dark brown. As she reached out to touch the doll, a strange sensation washed over her, a wave of melancholy so strong it nearly brought her to tears. She hesitated, pulling her hand back, but the doll seemed to beckon her, its gaze drawing her in. Against her better judgment, she picked it up. The doll was heavier than she expected, its body stiff and cold. Holly held it close, trying to shake the feeling of sadness that clung to her. She told herself it was just the atmosphere of the place, the old, dusty shop, the forgotten dolls. But as she left the shop, the doll cradled in her arms, the feeling of unease grew. Back at the cottage, Holly placed the doll on a chair in the living room. It seemed to fit perfectly there, as if it had always belonged. That night, she dreamed of the dollmaker, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and long, bony fingers. In the dream, he was carving a new doll, his hands moving with practiced precision. As he worked, he whispered to the doll, his voice a low, raspy murmur. Holly couldn't make out the words, but the tone was filled with anger and sorrow. The doll in her dream had no face, just a smooth, featureless head. But as the dollmaker continued to carve, the face slowly emerged a twisted, tormented expression, as if the doll itself was in pain. Holly woke with a start, her heart pounding. She looked over at the chair where she had placed the doll, half expecting to see it staring back at her with those dark, sorrowful eyes. But it hadn't moved. It was just a doll. Just an old, forgotten toy. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Holly would hear soft whispers in the night, the sound of rustling fabric, and footsteps echoing through the cottage. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, the remnants of the unsettling dream. But the whispers grew louder, the footsteps more insistent. And always they seemed to come from the direction of the doll. One evening, as Holly was preparing dinner, she heard a faint, childlike giggle. She froze, the knife slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. Slowly, she turned to look at the doll. It was sitting exactly where she had left it, but its head was now tilted slightly to the side, as if it were watching her. She approached the doll cautiously, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's just a doll," she whispered to herself. "It can't hurt you," but as she reached out to touch it, the doll's eyes seemed to shift, locking onto hers. The feeling of sadness returned, stronger than ever, but now it was mixed with something else, something dark and malevolent. Holly snatched her hand back, her skin tingling where she had almost made contact with the doll. That night, Holly dreamed again. This time, she was in the dollmaker's workshop, surrounded by unfinished dolls. The dollmaker was there too, but he wasn't working on a new doll. Instead, he was standing over a small child, a girl with dark curls and a burgundy dress. The girl was crying, her sobs echoing through the workshop. The dollmaker held her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "You will be perfect," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. Just like the others, the girl's sobs grew louder, more desperate, but the dollmaker didn't stop. He continued to murmur to her, his hands moving from her face to her throat. Holly wanted to scream, to run, to do something to stop him, but she was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. She woke up screaming, her body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the curtains. She could feel the doll's presence, even though she couldn't see it. It was as if the doll was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with each passing night. Desperate, Holly decided to return the doll to the shop. She couldn't keep it in the cottage any longer. She wrapped it in an old blanket and set off into the woods, the night air cold and sharp against her skin. The path seemed longer this time, the trees closing in around her, their branches reaching out like twisted, gnawed fingers. The whispers followed her, growing louder the closer she got to the shop. By the time she reached the clearing, she was nearly running, her heart racing with fear. She threw open the door and hurried inside, but the shop was different now. The shelves were empty, the dolls gone. The only thing left was a single chair in the center of the room, the same chair where she had found the doll. She placed the doll on the chair, but as she turned to leave, she heard the giggle again, louder this time, echoing through the empty shop. Holly froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned back to the doll. It was no longer sitting on the chair. It was standing, its head tilted to the side, its dark eyes fixed on her. She backed away, her hands trembling. "You're just a doll," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. The doll took a step forward, its tiny feet tapping softly against the wooden floor. Holly stumbled, her back hitting the door. The doll giggled again, a high-pitched, eerie sound that sent shivers down her spine. Desperate, Holly grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of wood from the floor, and swung it at the doll. The wood connected with a sickening crunch, and the doll crumpled to the ground. But instead of relief, Holly felt a wave of terror as the doll began to change. The porcelain skin cracked, revealing something dark and twisted beneath. The doll's eyes, once glassy and lifeless, now burned with a malevolent fire. It began to move, its limbs twisting and contorting as it pulled itself upright. Holly screamed, dropping the wood and turning to flee. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the shop itself was holding her prisoner, refusing to let her go. She could feel the doll behind her, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something sweet and clawing, like rotting flowers. She turned back to face the doll, her heart pounding in her chest. It was no longer a doll, but a grotesque mockery of one. Its face was a twisted mask of agony, its eyes burning with hatred. It reached out to her, its fingers elongating into sharp, jagged claws. With a final, desperate scream, Holly lunged at the door, throwing all her weight against it. The wood splintered, and she fell through, crashing onto the forest floor. The cold night air hit her like a slap, and for a moment she just lay there, gasping for breath. But the sensation of safety was fleeting. From inside the shop she could hear the doll know, the asterisk scraping and clawing at the doorway, trying to follow her. Holly scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. She didn't dare look back as she ran into the forest, branches tearing at her clothes, roots threatening to trip her with every frantic step. The path back to the cottage seemed endless, the trees closing in around her like an ever-tightening noose. Finally, the cottage came into view, a beacon of safety amidst the oppressive darkness. Holly dashed inside, slamming the door behind her and locking it with trembling hands. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting for it to burst open, for that cursed doll to come for her. But the door held firm, and after what felt like an eternity, the night fell silent once more. Holly sank to the floor, her entire body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The doll was still out there, somewhere in the woods, but she had made it back, she was safe. Or so she tried to convince herself. But the cottage no longer felt like a sanctuary. The air inside was thick with an unnatural cold, a creeping chill that settled into her bones. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and writhe, as if something unseen was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Holly's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The Dollmaker's curse, was it real? Had she unleashed something terrible by taking the doll from the shop? She had heard the stories, the warnings, but she had never believed them. How could she have known that they were true? Exhausted and terrified, Holly knew she couldn't stay in the cottage. The island no longer felt like the peaceful escape it once had been. Every inch of it seemed tainted by the Dollmaker's malevolence, by the spirits trapped within his cursed creations. She hurried to pack a bag, her hands still shaking. She needed to leave, to get as far away from the Isle of Wight as possible. But as she gathered her things, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The doll was sitting on her bed. Holly's heart lurched in her chest. She had left it in the shop, she was certain of it. But here it was, staring at her with those dark, burning eyes. Its once beautiful dress was now tattered, and its porcelain face was marred by cracks, the features twisted into a grotesque smile. How had it gotten here? Holly hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anything, and yet the doll was there, waiting for her, as if it had been there all along. She backed away slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't face that thing again. But as she turned to flee, the door slammed shut on its own, the force of it rattling the walls. Holly was trapped. The doll moved, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it climbed off the bed and took a step toward her. Holly tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, refusing to obey her desperate need to run. The doll's giggle filled the room, a chilling, childlike sound that echoed in her ears, driving her to the edge of madness. It reached out with one twisted hand, its claws gleaming in the dim light. In that moment, something inside Holly snapped. She wasn't going to die here. She wouldn't let this cursed Dollmaker take her soul. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and smashed it down onto the doll's head. The porcelain shattered, pieces flying in all directions. The doll crumpled to the floor, but the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swelling around the broken pieces, pulling them back together. The air grew heavy with the scent of burning wood and decaying flowers, and the doll began to rise once more, its form shifting and warping into something even more monstrous. But Holly was beyond fear now. She knew what she had to do. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed a box of matches, and hurried back to the bedroom. The doll was nearly whole again, its features twisting into a sneer as it watched her. Holly didn't hesitate. She struck a match and threw it onto the bed. The flames caught quickly, consuming the blankets and spreading to the doll. The fire roared to life, the heat intense and suffocating. But the doll didn't scream, it just watched her with those burning eyes, its body writhing as the flames devoured it. Holly backed away, the heat forcing her to retreat. The fire spread rapidly, consuming the room, the walls, everything. She had no choice but to flee the cottage, bursting out into the cold night air as the building behind her was engulfed in flames. She stumbled through the woods, her breath ragged, the fire lighting up the sky behind her. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the forest, the village lights flickering in the distance. The villagers saw the flames, and by the time they arrived, the cottage was nothing but a smoldering ruin. Holly stood there, covered in soot and shaking, watching as the fire died down to embers. But even as the flames consumed her grandmother's cottage, Holly couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The doll was gone, destroyed in the fire, but the curse still lingered. She could feel it in the air, in the way the shadows seemed to cling to the trees, in the way the wind whispered through the branches. The villagers took her in, comforted her, and tried to make sense of her wild story. Some believed her, some didn't, but it didn't matter. Holly knew what she had seen, what she had faced. She knew that the Dollmaker's curse was real, and that it had nearly claimed her. Days later, as she prepared to leave the island for good, she couldn't help but look back one last time. The forest stood silent, the ashes of the cottage long cold. But in the depths of the woods, she thought she saw something move, just a flicker of motion, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And in that moment she knew. The doll might have been destroyed, but the curse was far from broken. The Dollmaker's legacy lived on, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon it. Holly turned away, her heart heavy with the knowledge that some curses could never be escaped, only survived. As she boarded the ferry that would take her back to the mainland, she couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before the curse found her again, or worse, found someone else. The Isle of Wight, with its ancient woods and forgotten stories, faded into the mist behind her. But Holly knew she would never truly leave it behind. The Dollmaker's curse was part of her now, a shadow that would follow her wherever she went. And as the ferry pulled away, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of a child's giggle echoing across the water. Holly shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. She didn't look back. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.